Sorry.
Good morning. My name is Alia Azariah. I am the director of aftercare for Safe House. I'm also a survivor. And so I love getting to talk about survivor leader related topics as well as survivor care, which is usually what we focus our webinar series on is those survivor care topics. But it's always amazing when we get to kind of focus more on those working well with people with lived experience in the space in a professional capacity. So I'm excited to talk about this today. So this conversation actually came out of a conversation that Landon and Lala were having on the stage during a panel for our Safe House Project Attack conference back in January. And the way in which they were talking about making space for survivors to share their experiences was just very different than some of the other guidelines that I think I've been exposed to or that we've talked about in the field. And I just wanted to kind of bring some of those ideas. Like I think, the end consensus is always like when the survivor is ready, right? But how do we go about supporting a survivor who's like on that path? And I think I'm not to say that like one way is the right way, but I thought this was a really interesting conversation that needed to be elevated among the different kind of thoughts around this topic. And it's exciting that we get to have this webinar today because we started our webinar series this year on with an all survivor panel of a group of friends of mine that talked about hiring and working with people with lived experience in the workplace. I'm excited to get to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Latiana Appleberry. She is a Boston, Massachusetts native. She holds a master's degree in clinical social work from Boston College. She has over 15 years of experience and has worked directly with minor victims of CSEC, providing therapeutic services, crisis intervention, therapy, case management, and peer mentoring. But currently, Lala is the founder and executive director of Survivor Network North Carolina, which is a groundbreaking program. And in this role, she coordinates and fosters collaborations between direct service agencies, NGOs, law enforcement, educational institutions, and survivor leaders to create and implement survivor-informed and survivor-led protocols, policies, and programs and trainings. So she has a rich history of advising local, state, private, and government agencies on best practices and working with survivors. So she is a really incredible resource and specifically around guiding other survivors on their journey to be able to accomplish the things that Lala has been able to do as well. And then Landon Dixon is an accomplished mental health professional. He's got over a decade of experience in the field, and he serves as executive director for Ranch Hands Rescue and Bob's House of Hope, which was the first safe house in the country for young men who'd been sex trafficked. And he graduated from University of North Texas with a master's of science in clinical mental health counseling with a focus on trauma and crisis intervention. We've had Landon on a couple of our webinars now because of just some of his unique expertise and thoughts. So let's just jump in. So we're talking kind of about ethical storytelling, informed consent. I think one of the greatest, questions I always get, like, how do we tell as an organization that a survivor is ready and all of these things? And it's like, how do we juggle this agency of the survivor and wanting to promote that agency and autonomy with like being an organization that should be responsible? And so I'm excited to have this webinar as a resource for people. And ensuring that we're ethically telling stories and ethically working with survivors leaders in the space where they are sharing their story and not just as like a professional, a private person, involves ensuring that survivors maintain, full control over that story, including when and how they share them. And it's the responsibility of organizations to provide informed consent, which we'll talk about, and to support the survivors throughout while also respecting that right to adjust or even withdraw their participation. And so my question for Landon and for Lala, let's start with you, Lala. Given that only a person with lived experience, only the survivor can decide when they're ready to share their story, how would you recommend that organizations and service providers kind of assess and then support a survivor's readiness without influencing that decision?
Yes, thank you so much for having us, Alia. I love this topic, you guys. I'm so happy you all are here to hear us talk today. I want to point out that I am a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation, and I purposely did not put it in my bio because it's an example of how I share my survivorship and who I share it with. And so it's a small example of a way to respect the autonomy of survivors when they're wanting to identify and what parts of they're wanting to identify. But I think one of the first things to really understand about helping a survivor share their narrative is to understand why you would want them to do it, right? Like you want to make sure there's not any pressure behind it. And it's usually something the survivor should come to you and say, this is what I want to do, versus you coming and saying, hey, I think you're ready for this. Do you want to share your story? And being really careful about tokenization, that has been my story since I have been in this field, is being like the token survivor that is on the, in the work or in the meeting or wherever I was, and people just automatically assuming that I wanted to be identified as that and that I wanted to disclose that to everyone. So I would say ask yourself the question is, why, what is it? Why do I want to help the survivor leader share their story? And the first piece is remembering autonomy. They should have all the autonomy in the world to share what they want to share how they want to share it. And you as service providers, you realize it's not about you. It's like it literally has nothing to do with you. Actually, it's all about the survivor and what they want to share. And sometimes it may be that they don't want to share what you would like them to, and that has to be okay. And as providers, you have a responsibility. A lot of things come up with, when I think about when I first started sharing my story when I was 21, I would say I would share it all. I would be bare bones. I was like a duffel bag, right? And I was completely unzipped, and all of my supplies in my duffel bag was just out in the open. And as I got older and as I started doing more of this work, I realized there were certain pieces that I just needed to keep to myself. And there were some agencies and some people that respected it, but there were some that would push it and say, share more. Can you tell us details? And those agencies and those providers have to really ask themselves, like, why is it that you're wanting the survivor to do this? You should not be encouraging survivor leaders to share their story just to benefit a fundraiser, just to get, sympathy. I mean, I hate to say that word, but you the point of a survivor leader sharing any parts of their experience has to empower them only. There, if it benefits your organization, if it benefits some other part of what you're doing, that's awesome. But the sole and primary purpose of, helping a survivor do that, it should benefit them and it should empower them. Yeah,
Thanks, Lala.
sure.
And I can totally identify with what you said. I remember when I first started sharing my story, just so much like behind closed doors things that I shared because I felt like that was how I was being helpful. Like that was how I would advance like what other people were still experiencing. Like that was how I would advance the help for them. And it was actually like Audrey Morrissey at My Life, My Choice that told me like if you're having to take a whole day off work after you just spoke at an event, like you're sharing too much of yourself. Like you're hurting yourself and you need to change the things you're saying. And that like really stuck with me. So thanks for sharing that, Lala. Landon, I know you have I'm sure you have many points to say, but I know you also have like a great example of a way that you guys have practiced this, but would love to turn over you for your thoughts on the same question.
Sure, absolutely. And thank y'all for having me as well. It's definitely an honor to be here with you two ladies. Y'all are amazing people. And Lala, thank you for setting the stage there because I agree 100% with everything you said. My perspective is more adding it from the clinician side instead of being because I'm not a survivor leader, I'm a provider. And one of the things that I take very seriously as a service provider is confidentiality, but also the ethics of how things that could be or are confidential are shared. And so one of the challenges in this space that we've run into operating a shelter for males is, the best practice historically has been, if they're still in a program, do not let them share, period, anytime, anywhere, ever. And while I understand that, and I can appreciate the protectiveness that's intended, the hard truth is that it takes away autonomy again. So you're basically doing the same thing that was already done. Like, you don't have control over your own story. You don't get to decide. We decide for you. And that's harmful. That's where we can appear as traffickers without even meaning to, even with good intention. And so the way that we've handled it as an agency, especially trying to navigate this space with adult males, because there's not a lot of research out there. We don't really know what the best practices necessarily are going to look like. Obviously, we model it after those that currently exist, but there are differences, and there are different cultural differences that pop up as well, especially for our foreign national individuals. So what we do is something that Alia highlighted multiple times, and that's informed consent. To me, informed consent is the key to almost everything in this space. So what that looks like for us is we break it down. I mean, we say, here's the good, the bad, the ugly, what could happen, what will happen, what won't happen, what might happen. I mean, and then also what has already been said. You don't have to at any point in time. There will be no retaliation. There will be no consequences. There will be no, good, bad, right, wrong. You can stop in the middle of it. You can start and then say, I can't do this, and stop, period. You can revoke, change, alter at any time. And so, like I said, just really sitting down with the person for an extended period of time. And when I say extended period of time, I don't mean 2 or 3 hours before they speak. I mean,
Right.
like 2, 3 weeks, a month before the speaking opportunity, to really give them time to digest and think about it. And one of the things that's been very surprising to us, and I don't know if there's a pattern here or if it's just the guys that we've had, but they've really felt empowered by sharing their stories, and they share it in their, in the capacity that they're comfortable sharing it. But there's something about that advocacy piece for the guys that we've had that's been really important. And at least according to them, it's because this is so overlooked with males. And they said that was one of the hardest things, is like, nobody asked, everybody just assumed I was a bad kid, or that I was a bad guy or a criminal, or whatever term or label people threw at them. And so the opportunity to say, no, something happened. It's not just, I'm not just a bad person, something bad happened. And then being able to elevate that conversation for other males who may not have yet had the opportunity for healing or to tell their story, that advocacy has been very powerful for them. And we haven't really had any incidences of guys later regretting that they had told their story or that they had shared in that way, which was also, very positive, but surprising. Like, we're like, oh, that's good. That means maybe we're onto something here. We're doing something correctly, because we gave them all that opportunity, and then they got to decide for themselves. So that from the clinician side and from the programmatic leadership side, that's what I wanted to highlight, is that the informed consent piece and not taking away that autonomy.
Yeah, and we're gonna touch on that informed consent piece right now, but I wanted to say, like, that does make sense to me. Like, when you're saying, well, they wanted to share their experience, they chose to do this, it was their idea, that was their like prompting, and then that they had full control over what and how they said it with a lot of information. It makes sense that you wouldn't regret something that like was really important to you to do and that you instigated, right? So like, I love that. And moving, go ahead, Lala.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to jump back in
Oh,
if you didn't mind. And I wanted to piggyback off of what you said, Landon, because I didn't say it too, but that point of work with them before the actual event, right? I mean, yes. And working with them weeks and months in advance is always going to produce the best outcome. And I wanted to give you guys some really tangible, concrete things. So having a survivor leader that tells you they are ready to share their experiences, you sit down with them and you listen to it, ideally one-on-one, right? And then you ask them, how did that feel? what did that feel like for you? Did you feel anything in your body? This is where my therapy kind of comes into play. So maybe this is best with like some sort of therapeutic element, but you're asking them like, how did that feel for you? Did you feel anything in your body? Was there anything that you hesitated to say that you said that maybe after you said it, you were like, I don't really want to say that. Helping them create an outline, and then so they practice that one time, then they do it again, and then they do it again. And at least a couple of times before they finally get up on a stage or in front of strangers, because it's very different when you're talking to strangers versus someone that you know. And then secondly, having a community of survivor leaders is the most powerful thing I can encourage you guys to connect other survivors to, is because they are going to understand and relate on a different level that if you're just not a survivor, you just kind of don't get it. And so then what we do at Survivor Network, and see, we have a Speakers Bureau program. What we do is we have the survivor leaders, when they graduate our program, they tell their story to other peers, right? So we're just exposing them what this looks like, how to do it in front of providers, in front of your peers, in front of your family. And the idea is like, just get you saying it out loud and repeating the same thing, because it's less room for traumatizing yourself or your audience. Because I've done that. I've traumatized my audience by the things that I've said before. And it just leaves less room for that because there's more practice that they've done. Thank you.
No, that's amazing. And I'm gonna just ask you to kind of expand on that if you have anything else, Lala. Like what other steps, if there are any, would you advise organizations to take to ensure that conformed consent
Yeah.
is a process? Like maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, like what things, like I know for me, I definitely wish somebody had said like, hey, you're in the area that you like were exploited in, the likelihood that you like maybe when you share your story, it might be to your child's teacher, right? That you go a bit like these like little things that I wouldn't have thought of. Yeah, what kind of practical things would you advise that they
Yeah.
form a
So
survivor?
one thing for short outline, we have a worksheet that we have every survivor leader that says they're ready to share. They do an outline, and we broke it down by sections that say, okay, what were the vulnerabilities? What were the things that actually happened? How did you get out, and where are you now? And we make sure they focus a lot on their accolades and their accomplishments, even if they're little. So having an outline that they can look at all the time, it's so important that survivor leaders are saying the same parts of their story every time. It's crucial. Also, to your point, Alia, you have to tell the survivor leaders what are the implications of doing this, right? If you're going to go on a media channel or on the radio, the whole world can hear this or see this. They need to know that before they decide to sign up for that, right? If your trafficking happened in a certain area and now you're going to that DSS or that precinct, that wherever the police officers were, they need to know that that was in their neighborhood, and these are the things that can come out of it. And I think why people may shy away from sharing these implications is because fear that the survivor won't want to talk anymore. But that actually has to be okay. You actually have to allow them to have that power and that autonomy to decide that for themselves. Because remember, it's not about us, it's not about you, it's about them. And so being very, very overly transparent about what it means when you finally come out, because when you come out and you share your story publicly, you cannot take it back. It's already out there. And I wish that was something that somebody told me too. I'm okay now. Lots of trauma, lots of mistakes along the way, but you cannot take it back once you say it. So it's like getting in the water, like when you're at the beach and you tiptoe, you put your toe in, they say, okay, it's kind of cool. And then you put your whole foot and then you kind of walk in slowly. I'd much rather you share on a minuscule amount, little at a time. And then as you keep sharing and as your confidence continues to grow, you allow them to help them to share more and more and more each time.
Yep. Thank you so much. Landon, do you want to add to that?
Yes, please. Thank you. You triggered something in my brain that I wanted to make sure that I said. It was one of the things that we have seen, and this includes like people that are trying to do things ethically, that are, doing interviews. So like a de-identified webinar or podcast type thing, where they have the opportunity to tell their story, or their story is going to be part of a bigger narrative or project or something like that. So they're not going to be personally identified, but elements of their story will be present. As with most things in life, it comes with paperwork. So one of the things that I have found is that these entities that have the paperwork for, what the informed consent is, and what they're going to do with the information and blah, 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 is that they almost think that that form and the person signing it is enough, and it's not. So, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, but they will then rush through it. And so what we've had to do is take a moment and say, no, I've literally had to tell people this. No, we're going to take a minute. We're going to read through everything on here. I'm going to make sure, in our case, he understands every element of this, because to me, it's really unfair when you throw paperwork at somebody that doesn't even have, like, they haven't even finished middle school, let alone high school, college, master's degree. And some of the language in these, NDAs or these informed consents, I struggle with it. I got a master's degree and I've been doing this stuff for years. And I'm like, what is this word? I've got to Google it. I have no idea what this means. And sometimes a couple of times we've even had to consult with a lawyer, because we're like, what are they actually asking of this person here? And there's been actually a couple of times where I've insisted on changes to a contract, or changes to an informed consent, or what have you, because once they understood what was actually stated in there, they're like, ooh, I'm not comfortable with that. And I said, okay, let's change it. And, thankfully, the couple of times that's happened, the other individual or other entity's been very understanding, very much on board with making the changes and the updates. But I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that part of our advocacy as professionals is making sure that any kind of legalese, any kind of legal language that's included in this process is broken down in such a way that, you don't have to have an advanced law degree to understand it.
I'm so glad you brought that up too, because like we've talked a little bit about this kind of like stuff before, Landon, but like my own lived experience, adult film was such a big part of like my adult experience. And that same, like, let's give you paper, like, let's give you this contract that you have no like schooling around or no like understanding of how to do this. And some of the things are very similar in the, as far as like the rights to that video and the rights to like how it will be used and when it will be used. Like you just, it can be very re-traumatizing even just in the contract itself for people with lived experience. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah.
So what are some more of these like ethical challenges that might arise when a survivor shares their stories, and how can an organization navigate these challenges while maybe definitely respecting the survivor's autonomy? Who wants to start with that? Some additional challenges.
Yeah. It's hard. I want to say it's a tough spot to be in as a provider. I think we are I'm actually on both sides of this fence, right? I'm a survivor and I'm a provider, and we're very overly protective. When I first started, I'm like, listen, are you sure you want to say this? You want to say it like this way? And I was very like overzealous and like, oh my God, I want to protect them. But at the end of the day, back to Landon's point, autonomy is super important. And so just remembering your why you're doing this is going to be very crucial in all of this. I think that connecting survivors to a support network, providing therapy or psychological emotional support is before, during, and after, like have it queued up on deck and ready, is going to be very important. I think too, if you're going to have survivors speaking and sharing their story, having like almost like when you go to court and you have like a victim advocate, having their own advocate there with them, like in the same space. So that way, if something happens, they could come to you right after because you'd be that trusting person. And then just providing a bunch of tools, connecting with survivor networks, around the state, around the country. There are so many agencies that help survivors do this work. And if you are not familiar how to do that or implement certain things, there are resources out there to do that. I think it's very irresponsible to embark on this journey and not have resources available for survivor leaders or yourself on how to navigate this. I think that if you don't have resources or know where to locate them, then you should not do it. Very plainly put, you should not do it. It's irresponsible. Yes, sorry, Alia. I think I just went on a
Okay.
tangent.
I mean, they're all very important points. I actually,
Agreed.
and Landon, if you have something to speak to this, I'll give you a second to do that. But I have maybe a more direct question, and I'm just going to be direct about it, honestly, because, and I'll tell you why. So our organization had partnered with somebody who was claiming to be a survivor. This was a few years ago, right? And I can tell you, like, and I think that, like, we as people with lived experience often have like an extra, like a sixth sense or an extra level of discernment around like other people with lived experience. And so I could tell you that, like, I initially had like, I personally was like, that's not somebody that I'm going to choose to partner with personally, right? As soon as, like, kind of before even meeting her, right? And I'm never one to like question somebody's lived experience and like doubt that this experience that they're sharing is true. In this specific person's situation, she was actually like creating a story of exploitation for clout and had not experienced exploit. I'm sure she's experienced trauma. I don't feel like normal, healthy, well-adjusted people would do that, but like definitely was not a survivor of trafficking in the way that she was. The story that she was saying about exploitation had not happened to her. And that was something that like obviously hurt the survivor community, as we're there like trying to, bring in a sea of myths and doubts and all of these things like that we're trying to be advocates for, and then also hurt our organization and had the potential to hurt many other organizations that she was partnering with. So please hear my heart in that, and I'm not trying to like say this in a way that is not trauma informed or not sensitive to people. But knowing that has happened, right? One of the greatest questions that I get from like my local organizations that I work with is like, how do we, when it's not somebody who used to be a client of ours, right? When it's someone else out there and we're like looking to like bring them in for a training or an awareness event or whatever it is, how do we ensure that like we're working with somebody who is reputable and that we're not going to harm them, but then also that they're not going to harm, I mean, service providers do a lot of great work when they're great organizations, right? That they're not going to harm that either. Am I making sense in the question that I'm asking? And Lala, I'll hand this to you first.
Oh yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is protection factor for organizations, right? Their credibility. That is what we're kind of talking about. So I think it's important. Ali, you just said something about as a fellow survivor, there's parts of your discernment that you're going to be able to identify. Same thing with me. If you can have a survivor leader involved in the vetting process, and it's not to say this did happen or this did not happen, but you're also assessing for readiness, and you're looking for some level of fluidity in the way that they're sharing their story. I think that if anybody comes to you completely as a stranger, you've never worked with them before, you don't know much about them, and they say, I want to share my story with your organization, I already think you should have a red flag up, because why you? Where'd they find you? You don't know them. And so then the vetting process needs to happen. We at Survivor Network, we have two measures that we actually go by when we're trying to see who, because there is a readiness piece of sharing your story. And there's the protective piece comes in. It's like, yes, you tell me you're ready, you want to share your story, but are you ready? And that's where our responsibility comes in at. So survivor leaders must participate in our peer support our virtual peer support programming, where we do a lot of interpersonal digging and talking and connecting with other survivors virtually. And through that, we are able to see their readiness. We're able to see how they communicate, the things that they share, how the trauma or triggers may affect them or not affect them. And then they graduate to our Speakers Bureau training, which, and for each of these, you have to have been out of that trafficking situation for a year and a half. A year and a half for our Speakers Bureau, 6 months for our peer support. And that's also a piece of us that wants to protect the survivor leaders, because some survivors will come out of the life or out of their situation and like 2-3 months and say, I'm ready to share. And I just don't believe that. I think there's too much healing that needs to happen right after. And so while you want to respect their autonomy, maybe there's something you can do to help them craft their story internally with the organization. It's not something that they would share out loud. But yeah, I think back to your question is having referrals. We often ask if we don't know, because we often get survivor leaders from all over, and we will often ask them to give us a referral from a therapist, a person they've worked with in the past, a case manager that says that they are ready to, share and that they've been able to overcome some things. So make sure you're vetting. If you can have a survivor leader in your vetting process, that's like the biggest thing you can do. We have this supernatural sense of power that we just kind of like, okay, tell me more, or, whatever it is. And so I would definitely say to have a vetting process, and then put a requirement in place for how long since their last trafficking situation would they be eligible to speak for your organization. And if you make it a blanket thing, like it's not specific per survivor, but if you make it a blanket requirement, 6 months, 18 months, there's no favoritism. There's no, well, you did this for this survivor, but not one for this one. And so, yeah, having like a threshold of how long it has to be before they can share.
Thanks, Lala. And we didn't even talk about this beforehand. And that's like with our local organizations, that's what I'm always like, get a reference. And I'm happy to like jump on the phone with them and be like, hey, if you're going to come up here and speak, like would love to introduce you to our like local survivor, and like, and I can get on the phone and I can see what they need, or how can they be comfortable, or would you like me to be there? Do you want somebody else? Like I can be part of making them feel comfortable and saying, there's something seems off here. So Landon, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, I'll circle back to the ethics question, because I think y'all, I don't have anything to add. Y'all nailed it. I agree completely. So on the ethics side, I think probably the biggest issue in this space that we all wrestle with back and forth, and I'm going to use a fairly intense term here, but I think it's necessary to highlight it, trauma porn. That is a big issue in this space, and a lot of organizations using survivor stories in that way that is exploitative, honestly, even when it's de-identified. And there's a real challenge here and a real difficulty, and I think conversations like this are how we advance the issue and understand where the lines are, so to speak. I think there's a number of things that are obvious to most of us, that you don't do graphic depictions like that's, you don't need that. You don't need the graphic depiction, and you don't need extreme detail. It's just not necessary. And there's an element of reality here, because there are so many people that don't believe, that deny survivors' stories and say, no, that's not true. And I know that's true on the female side, but it's especially true on the male identifying side. Every single one of the guys that we've worked with, and we've worked with over 110 now across the country, that they've all said, nobody believed me. I tried to tell, or I didn't bother telling because of, XYZ. Like there's just so much stigma and disbelief that there's an element of a reality check for people. So you do have to hit them with some of the truth, some of the reality of these case examples and what's happening to individuals. I mean, people have a hard time believing it, but torture is a very real part of this too. I mean, sometimes survivors are being purchased, I hate to use that word, but it's the word, for torture, not sex. And remembering that this is a power and control issue, it's not about sex and sexuality. It's about power, it's about control, it's about things beyond sex. And so recognizing that the impact could be on several different domains, and that it impacts the whole person. I think it's critical that we're looking at, again, as organizations and talking to survivor leaders, what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate, how do we get people to actually understand the realities faced, but doing so in a way that's appropriate and affirming and empowering, especially because, and the reason that I'm saying this about how do we get it across, right? How do we get the reality across is because one of the biggest challenges that we faced, and Lola, I don't know if this applies for y'all as well, but is operations funding. People don't seem to understand that it's not enough to provide a house and love. Like that's not enough. You have to, as Lala was saying earlier, and Alia as well, you have to bring in referrals. You have to have access to trauma-informed medical care and dental care and legal assistance and life skills, education, vocation. I mean, like I said, it impacts the whole person. And so if you're not providing things in a holistic manner, you're not providing true recovery opportunities. And so I'd say on all that to say, the vast majority of people who are not in this space do not understand the severity and the need for that much, that there needs to be all those wraparound elements in place. And so how to get that across to the people that don't understand, but that are in a position of power and authority, and likely in many cases in a funding position, because we all know you can't have a program, no matter how wonderful it is, if there's not a way to fund it. So creating that balance, I think, is really where this conversation will need to evolve over time, because we work very hard not to use trauma porn and not to use an exploitative narrative storytelling and approach, and certainly not to raise money. But there are elements of the harsh realities of this that we've had to have conversations, say, maybe not on such a public level, but with, say, law enforcement, right? Or policymakers, or those individuals that, again, it's not necessarily a public sharing, but it is sharing some of the details of stories, not grotesque details, in order for them to fully understand what we're dealing with, what we're facing, what these individuals are up against when it comes to reintegrating into the community. And so, I would love to hear additional thoughts from the two of you on that topic, but I just thought that when we're talking about ethics, that to me is the biggest thing to be elevated.
You are preaching, Landon. I was like over here clapping because, oh my God, that is literally what our organization is centered around, is these other things, because telling your story and sharing their story, it's like the last thing of the needs. Polaris Project did a study on the post-trafficking, what survivors are looking for. And the main things that came out of that was helping with jobs, helping with housing, and a supportive survivor community. And so we try really, really hard when survivors come to us and they say that they're ready to share their story, you are now a part of the program. Yeah, we're going to help you do that. We're also going to help you, sharpen your job skills and interview skills. We're going to help you, rewrite your resume and create a bio. And we're going to help you apply for housing opportunities and things like that. And so all of these things really are very, very important and as a whole, and not just pieces of it. And I'm so happy you said that. And I feel like that's a whole nother part too of this when we're talking about it, really. But yeah, that was great, Landon. That was great.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And Lala, do you have anything else you want to share on that trauma porn?
It's important. The only thing I want to say, I'm pleading here, is that, I'm going to use my analogy that I always use, Alia. It's like this trajectory that I believe exists in survivorship. It's of your survivors, people that are experiencing trafficking are victims, then they become survivors, then they become leaders. So if you're looking at this little line here, and there's a victim, survivor, leader, each stage has different needs. But the thing about, to avoid trafficking recidivism, that's when you get over here to this leader stage. This is where those additional needs that most organizations or most funders aren't funding. That's the job readiness and the employment and the housing. And, you know, when survivors get out of that trafficking situation, they may be stable, but how do we help them thrive? What do we do? What's our responsibility to help them thrive? That's all the things that come with being in that leader stage. And so a lot of agencies and organizations fall short in being that, offering that bridge. Because at the end of the day, if I'm just stable and I'm not thriving, that means it's only going to take me losing my job to go back to trafficking, me losing my car to have to pay for a new car. It's only going to take one thing to get me back into that trafficking situation. And then I'm back at the victim stage and I'm starting all over again. So if you want survivors to stay out, when you guys are writing your grants and you're putting your budgets together, you have to put line items for leadership. You have to put line items for job readiness, and you have to put line items to help survivors thrive beyond the victimization. It's not enough to get them stable. Not if you want to do good work, and not if you want to keep them out of the trafficking. Sorry, I'm used to saying the life.
It's perfect. And I have one more question that you guys are not prepped for. So if you don't have an answer, it's okay. But like, I'm thinking like so if I go do a keynote at something, right? Like I have a rates sheet. I know what I'm getting paid. I know what I'm going to ask for that. And for me, it's like, I don't necessarily need to do that to survive because I have a full-time job, but like for me it's like, is this worth the travel? Is it worth dealing with getting childcare? Is it worth doing that? And that's kind of what my rate sheet is based off of. There would have been a time in my life, however, that if an organization came to me with a certain amount of money, I would have felt like I had no choice but to tell my story and to do what they wanted, because that money was so necessary for me being able to pay my rent, on like me being able to provide for my needs and my kids' needs was dependent on me sharing my story. Would love to hear again, Lala, if you have thoughts on that or anything you can say, or like you would advise organizations to make sure that they're not, like, when they are being honoring and making sure that a survivor does get an honorarium or a stipend or the money that they should receive in these situations, that's not being exploitative by kind of putting that survivor in a forcible position where now they feel they have to tell their story to pay their bills.
That's a great point. I think we always present the opportunity first and the valuable, what would be the value to them outside of the finances. And once they kind of agree to it, then we'll tell them what the compensation is. We advocate for the compensation and we base it around the U.S. Advisory Council rate. But I do want to say this. At the end of the day, would you ask a doctor to go and perform a surgery for free? No, probably not. You would not ask a doctor to do that. And survivors are looked at as educators, they're looked at as teachers, and they're teaching the audience something. And so they should be compensated. When you think about compensation, you think about, like Alia said, the time it takes to get there. Is it worth it? Are they going to miss work? Do they have to drive for hours? What are all these factors that are included? And as contractors, you know, taxes and all these things, your job is also to help them understand how to charge appropriately for their time and their expertise. And it's not to be exploited, but I do believe that survivor leaders should be compensated for their time and that they should be compensated for their expertise on anything that they're speaking about. I'm trying to think about how to answer the second part of that question about how do you make sure that it isn't being re-exploitive. I think that's just going to be a person that has a good heart. I don't know. I think that if you are in this work, the ultimate goal is not to be re-exploiting survivors, although I've actually seen agency trafficking. And so I guess the way we do it, like I said, is we always talk about the opportunity that is at hand, what they would learn from it, what they would benefit, what kind of things would come out of it. You know, you get to create a presentation, you get to practice your public speaking, you'll get to network with other people in the field. I can connect you with these other resources. And it also has a compensation of this involved. But by no means should you, shame on anybody that's using it as hey, if you do this, it will get you, you know, $400 or whatever it is. Shame on them for that. And they will be caught. You know, you don't do that. Don't do that.
Lala will find you.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump into the questions we have, but Landon, did you have anything you wanted to share on that?
No, I was actually thinking the same thing. There's a couple in the Q&A that I was like, ooh,
Yeah.
I can answer that for you.
I think one of them, because this is something that I see all the time, something that we do as an organization, like the first question I want to ask is that question by Wheeler, which I'm sure you guys can see where she's asking about like the written survivor stories. So a lot of organizations will have like a newsletter or post something on social media. And I mean, we do the same thing. So like Wheeler saying they don't share their names. I know we like will like maybe tweak a couple things if it needs to be de-identified a little further. What are the ethics around that? What would you guys speak to using those written survivor stories, especially when it's survivors in their program? Maybe somebody got a GED or went back to college and they're trying to share those success stories. What would you say would be the ethics around that?
Ask for permission. And if you are going to make money off of it in the form of fundraising, then offer some small stipend or gift card or something, because you're using that to raise money. But I would definitely, the first thing is ask for permission. Most times they're going to say, okay, as long as you keep it anonymous and you oblige to what you said you're going to do, most times they're going to be okay with it. So just ask for permission.
Yeah, Landon,
Agreed.
what do you want
Yeah,
to add?
agree. Asking permission, that again, the informed consent, that's the central piece of it. Something that we've done as well, especially if there's like, if it's something that's particularly pulling at the heartstrings, like for us, we're like, oh my God, I just want to share this. This is so amazing. Because we do have those moments and it's what keeps you going on the hard days. I will review what I wrote first. So I will literally say, here's what I wrote. Are you okay with this? So again, asking that permission, getting that, de-identifying 100%, definitely focusing on the empowerment side as much as possible, obviously is also a good thing. And then to me, I think a good way to do it is, and please feel free to disagree with me, y'all, is to do like group update. So it's not, you're not talking about, such and such, even though it's de-identified, John Smith or Jane Doe got their GED this week. Woo! Like instead of that, it's more like all of the guys in our program completed their GED in the last 6 months or this year or something like, like we're celebrating the group accomplishments, if you will. To me, that is also a good way to do it, and something that at least our guys have been on board with, because it kind of, I guess the way they describe it is they feel like they're being uplifted as a family, like all of them together, as opposed to just singling out one person. And then you get into questions of favoritism, which, again, speaking on the ethics, that's something that used to happen in the trafficking, right? Where this person gets favoritism over that person. And so then they start doing those things because they feel like, all kinds, it's a cascade, right? So again, doing it as a group kind of helps avoid some of those pitfalls as well.
Yeah, and I'll share that, like when I graduated program years ago, I went back on their Instagram page after graduating and looked and saw like what did they share of mine, and even just looking at like, well, did they share about somebody else more than they shared about me? Just like survivors will see those things. We don't just walk away and not look back. So there's a couple follow-up questions with that. One of them is, if there's a media release signed on admission, is that enough, or should they ask every time? Go, Lala.
That's a great question. I think that if you have a media release, that is good practice. But if you want best practice, ask every time, because and I know that we can get certain information and we will use it in different ways, that when we got them to sign that media release, they knew it was going to be for this particular project. But because it's a media release and we have this other project, we're going to use it here. We know that switches up and that changes. So best practice is to ask every time. Having it in, one time is good practice. But if you want to be the best, ask every time.
Yep.
Agreed.
Landon, anything you want to add? Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so this one is another really great question. So the attendee said, like, okay, so we're advising not to share that graphic detail, right? Like I've definitely gone to things where it wasn't even, I don't think I've ever been traumatized by I've probably traumatized rooms by things that I've shared, but I don't know that I've ever been traumatized by another survivor leader that was speaking. I know I definitely felt traumatized by like a service provider one time that spoke at a keynote and shared some really graphic details around sexual assaults that they had seen at like a gala dinner. So, okay, so if you're recommending that they don't share the kind of the graphic and grotesque details of the story, how do you do that without policing them and with still giving them autonomy?
Do you mind if I take this one to start? Thank you. Because I want to speak to it from a clinical side. The key, in my opinion, and especially if we're talking under 2 years at that survivor stage, right? You like all I said, the victim, survivor, survivor leader. Once they're out of the victimhood, they're in survivorhood. If it's before 2 years, at least, maybe longer, depending on the individual, you can actually be re-traumatizing yourself by sharing those details. So not just traumatizing others, but reactivating it within yourself. And from a trauma therapist standpoint, the real harm that's done there is that you continue to train your brain and your body that these stories, these experiences are untouchable. They're always going to overwhelm you. They're always going to be too much and just beyond the ability to cope. And that's counterproductive to trauma recovery. That's counterproductive to post-traumatic growth. So in terms of like you're not policing, you're providing psychoeducation. You're saying, doing this trauma dump is how it's commonly referred to. The more official term would be flooding. When you're flooding yourself in that way and having all those emotions, all those thoughts, all those stories, everything coming up and coming out without regulating, internally learning self-regulation and how to do, it's why EMDR is so highly structured, as a therapeutic modality, because you do often dig into the details, even if not verbally up here. And so there's a lot of tight parameters about maintaining regulation and staying within one's window of tolerance. Because if you start getting out of that window of tolerance, again, you risk reactivating, re-traumatizing, and actually making things worse in the long run. So to me, it's less about policing their story and how they tell their story, and more about just providing psychoeducation that says, look, this is the impact of that from a trauma perspective. And I always explain the why behind the things I say, because I think it's important for people to know and to have their own buy-in. But also I'm like, look, I'm happy to send you the articles, the books, the research. I will give you all the materials that are scrambled around in here so you can read it for yourself and see this is why we recommend that, or in this case, don't recommend that. So obviously that doesn't change the fact that if somebody still wanted to proceed and share that, and that was important to them, that gets into a whole other discussion, at which point I would actually defer to some person, personally and professionally, I would defer to Alia or Lala or Jose Alfaro or some other lived experience expert that would then be able to guide that survivor and help them just understand it or decide for themselves. Because I'm sure there's somebody that's an important piece of it, to share that level of detail. But if they're insistent on that, especially after I've given them the psychoeducation, I'm then going to hand them over to, or rather connect them with somebody that has a lot of experience in this space that can talk it through with them.
Yeah.
And just to jump on the end of that sentence about it is, so what I would do as a survivor leader is I'd say something like, well, you want to share these details. So what is the impact that you want the audience to leave with? What are you trying to get out of it, and really helping them process what about sharing those grotesque details are they getting out of it, right? I think that answering your question to the person, oh, you took it away. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not about policing the story. It's about, not sensationalizing the story, right? Asking them like, what would be the point of sharing those details? And then the point of practicing, someone else had wrote in the comments over here, is sharing, they use the term sharing their story over and over again. It's not about sharing over and over again. It's about practicing, practicing, practicing. This is how you understand what feels good to you and what feels bad to you when you're sharing your story. The growth test details, unless, like I said, that survivor is insisting on doing it, they're just not that important. If somebody needs to hear the growth test details of trafficking, Google it. There's so many stories online. The survivor does not need to share that to make a maximum impact. So that is what I would really try to relate to the survivor leaders, is that you don't have to share that. And also, how does that make you feel? And then I might even say, as a survivor leader, when you said that, I felt something. I had an emotional reaction to you sharing that, and I might share that education as a peer. And so, yeah, and then everything else Landon said, I echo.
Amazing. And Lala, I want to ask, we only have 2 minutes left, but I want to ask you this question. And if it goes over, that's fine. Feel free to jump off. I just think that this is a very, very important question that Ashton has. What are the differences on ethics with youth survivors sharing their stories?
Oh my goodness. Listen,
Do a whole nother webinar.
I don't think you should do it. I don't think youth should do it, because there are things that I did under 18 years old that I regret as an adult. I think if they are insisting on sharing, do it in a safe space, do it in a peer support group, do it with their therapist. But to be just out publicly sharing, that's something that, I mean, how many of you guys were a minor, shared something or post something online, and then, like, as you got older and you look back at it, I was like, oh my God. I mean, I'm 35, right? I was 21 when I did this, and I look back and I'm like, what were you thinking? Why would you, why? And it haunted me for a very long time. I just don't think minors should be doing it in a public way. And it needs to be a therapeutic way that they share their stories. So
I usually tell the girls that I work with, like, maybe it's time to start writing your book.
yes, there you go.
Right? Like, maybe it's time to start writing your book. And that, like, oftentimes they've found that to be a really great outlet for that need and desire.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else you guys want to add? We're at time, but anything else you want to?
I want to just leave this little nugget, is that when survivors decide that they are prepared or that they're ready to share their narrative and what happened to them, it's usually because no one's ever heard it. They've never been able to go to court and share about it. A lot of survivors come out way later on in life about what's happened to them. So they were never able to get the justice. So they want to share it. They weren't believed by someone, so they want to share it, or they just want to help and assist others. And so really identifying the root for them, or helping them identify the root why they want to share their narrative, will be important, because it may be that they don't want to share it publicly, but they need someone to hear it. And maybe your job is to help them find who is the one that needs to hear it to bring them peace. Yeah.
That's so good, Lala. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Landon, you have anything else you want to add before we close?
No, I would say the only thing that I would add is just one, remembering that these conversations are important to have, as uncomfortable as they are. That's the key, is to be able to have the conversations and then be open to the answers. Also, as I said earlier, this does actually happen to males as well. So please keep an open mind that boys and young men are impacted as well. As are transgender youth, they're at incredibly high risk. So please keep an open mind that this isn't a one person or one demographic issue. It impacts all socioeconomic statuses, ethnicities, races, I mean, you name it. And so just being open to that. And then the only other thing I would say on the minors piece is just, I agree with Lala. It's not an appropriate thing to share, because they're still kids and their brains aren't fully developed to the extent that they can make those decisions and really understand fully. But also, if you're gonna do it, I would say do the group update thing, just the positive, just the empowering, and just as a group, hey, all of our kids had a great service project this weekend, something to that effect. Just because, I mean, let's be honest, it's social media. You really don't need to be putting out a whole bunch of stuff that's real about you as a person. Anyway, it's not safe. So it's better to keep it general and as a group and whatnot, just for all of us on social media at this point. So don't really care if people don't like that, but that's how I feel about social media. So I'll leave
Yep.
you with that.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Lala and Landon, for sharing your expertise and just everything that you do. So they are very, very helpful. And thank you all for being willing to just come and listen today. And we'll see many of you, I'm sure, next month.